My name is Kearney.
And my name is Will Campbell. Our videographer is Sam Reinbold, and we're here interviewing James Kearney at Marquette University High School on May 1st.
All right, so Mr. Kearney, when were you born, and could you tell us where?
I was born in Hibbing, Minnesota on May 26, 1942.
And what did your family consist of? Siblings, parents?
At the time, it was just my mother and father. I'm the oldest. Later on, we had a younger brother, a year and 3 months younger than I am, and my sister 5 years younger.
Right. Was your family religious at all?
Oh, quite. Very Irish Catholic, and the extended family was very Irish Catholic. We were very aware of the fact, made aware of the fact that we were Irish, and we were staunchly Catholic. And this is, of course, the 40s and 50s, and things were a bit different then than they are now.
And would you say that was kind of similar throughout the rest of the town, or?
Well, town was mostly Protestant, and Catholics were not exactly considered to be accepted by a lot of people, shall we say. There was a fair amount of prejudice. Some of it veiled, some of it overt, but it was there.
Do you remember anything else about Hibbing in particular?
Well, I mean, I don't remember much about the room in which I was born. However, I lived in Coleraine, which is about 20 miles west of Hibbing, because my dad taught there at Greenway High School. But my grandparents, my mother's parents, lived in Hibbing, and we were very close to them, so we spent a lot of time at Hibbing, every holiday for certain, and most Sundays, all the way up through my high school years, we went to Hibbing.
What schools did you attend in Coleraine?
Well, Greenway Grade School, Greenway High School.
Right,
And then all Greenway.
And
John
then,
C. Greenway was the guy who founded the town, as a matter of fact. His statue was in the Senate Rotunda. Every state could put 2 statues in, and his is there, but not for Minnesota, it's for Arizona. He wanted my grandfather to go with him when he went to Arizona, and had he done that, we wouldn't be having this interview right now.
any favorite classes or subjects?
Well, at that time, now this is the 50s, of course, so when I was in high school, we were pretty much streamlined into the scientific vein, no matter what our interests were. I liked English better than I liked most of the other subjects, although I also liked biology. But I took all of the math classes, all of the science classes, because that was the direction the country seemed to be taking at the time.
And so, outside of school, what else did you do in your free time?
Well, I was heavily involved in sports through my whole childhood and high school, primarily baseball and football and hockey. We got a rink when I was 8, so that's when I started skating seriously. And then I played hockey through high school and football. I was out for track 1 year, but I didn't care for the coach, so I didn't go out again. Spent a whole lot of time in the woods. In high school, I'd head out the door on a Saturday morning with a rifle in my hand before dawn and come home after dark and just wandered around. Sometimes I'd go with some of my friends and sometimes I'd go alone, but I learned a lot about the woods, just doing that kind of thing. I miss that, to be honest.
Did you ever run into danger in the woods or anything?
Well, I ran into bear 7, 8 times, but they always behaved the same. They took off before I did. One time there'd been a bear in town. That usually happened in the spring when they came out of hibernation. And So a neighbor of mine and I, whom I spent a lot of time in the woods with, and I decided to go out and sight in a rifle that he had just bought out near the ski hill. There was an international ski hill in that town. And we got to this place, dead ended, and where we were going to shoot into this bluff. And a bear came out of the woods and kind of ambled across and up the side of the hill. So we went back to town and got the guy's father. The guy was incessantly talking about what a great shot his father was, who got his .30-30, and I still had the .22. Oh, by the way, my brother was along. He didn't spend a lot of time in the woods at all. The first time we went out there, he was carrying the .22 that we were going to sight in. And he kept saying over and over and over again, now you guys, because we were walking ahead of him, we see that bear, you guys get out of the way because I'm going to shoot it with a .22, which would have just made the bear mad. That's all it would have done. So all of a sudden there's the bear, and he's about 40 feet in front of us. So I turn around and look for my brother, and he is hoofing it down the road as fast as he can go, gun in hand. He didn't have any interest in dealing with that bear at all. The next time we went out there, the bear was back in there, and we found out later that somebody had poached the deer and left the guts and whatnot in there, so he was feeding on that. And this time he came out a lot slower because nothing had happened the first time, until my neighbor's dad opened up on him with the .30-30, and he missed at about 40 feet. I suspect he was trying to, but nevertheless it shut the kid up about what a great shot his dad was forever after.
Could you describe your group of friends for her?
Well, they're all Iron Range kids. I mean, some of them were goofier than others. Most of them were involved in athletics. I said the guys I was closest to were not. They were kind of the class nerds, but I spent most of my weekends, I mean during the day with those guys. I didn't spend much time with them at night because they didn't do much, but during the day we spent a lot of time in the woods doing a whole lot of things. Shooting up everything.
And I mean, so you mentioned the bear adventure, but were there any other specific adventures that you guys had that were quite memorable?
That I can talk about, you mean?
Sure, feel free.
Well, there was a one time, as I said, we used to shoot up a lot of stuff, and of course the land around there was all mining company land. And so it kind of alternated between mines and ore dumps and woods. And we'd have to cross ore dumps to get into the woods. So there was a little shack up there that had a 4-pane window in it. And there were 4 of us. So we were standing maybe 100 yards off with .22s and decided to have a little contest to see who could put out a pane. So we each picked one and we started blazing away at these panes. And we hear somebody yelling, and finally realized it came from inside the shack. So a miner was working overtime on Saturday, and he went in there to take a break, and all of a sudden bullets started whizzing through the walls. So we beat it down the dump and into the woods. But we also got called in by the mine superintendent. He knew there were some kids up there. He didn't know who. So we weren't willing to confess that it was us that shot up the shack and almost shot up that miner. But anyway, we stopped carrying guns for a while simply because of that.
Did you have any particular hobbies yourself that?
Well, I was into a lot of typical stuff. I was coin collecting and tax collecting, collecting baseball cards and things like that. In high school, I took a correspondence course in taxidermy, so I did that for a few years. Our basement was full of birds and whatnot that I had mounted. In fact, one of those same guys one time called me up and he said, "Do you still stuff stuff?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I got something, I'll help you with it." I said, "What is it?" I can't talk about it on the phone. Because at that time we had operators and we were always concerned about their listening in. So I figured, something was up. So he came up to the house with a backpack on, and he reaches into the backpack and he hauls out 19.5 inches of neck. He'd shot a blue heron. There was a $150 fine at the time for killing these things. So this is 1958, 59. That's a lot of money. So we mounted it. His idea of helping was to take the tendons out of the legs and make a network of heron tendon across the pipes in my basement. That was all the help I got from him. But I did a nice job with the bird, had it sitting on a piece of driftwood with the wings out and the head back a bit. So I wanted to keep it, but he took it home, and his mother didn't like it. So he had it in his bedroom. She would take it down into the basement when he was at school, and he'd have to go down to get it and bring it back into the bedroom, and then the next day when he got home, it'd be back in the basement. This went on for a while. I don't know who gave up on this one, but I told him I'd take the bird, but he wasn't willing to give it up. So I can't think of anything else I did as a hobby.
All right, so as a kid, was there any particular profession that you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, I wanted to be a veterinarian.
And
That was my plan.
was there any certain like experience that you had that helped kind of gear you towards that, or?
Well, just the fact that I liked animals, you know, and I liked biology, and I liked being in the woods and all that other kind of stuff, so that was primarily it. I mean, I've always been kind of fascinated with animals, even am to this day.
Any animal in particular?
Yeah, I'm very fond of hawks.
Yeah.
I like the red tail in particular. But hawks are cool.
Did you have any run-ins with any specific animals when you were younger, or?
It seems to be a loaded question. At any rate, yes. My freshman year in college, I was home for Christmas break and found a hawk that had been shot. His wing was broken, a red tail. So I took it home and put a splint on its wing and started feeding it, because it obviously couldn't feed itself. So I'd go out and get squirrels and bring it back, and the thing would eat the squirrel, eat the whole squirrel, except for the bones and foot on the left hind leg. That's what apparently he hung on to while he picked the rest of it apart. So we found these pellets of fur and bone all over the basement because he coughed those up after he digested the rest. And I remember one time during that was only a 2-week period, but I remember one time during my dad woke me up about 5 in the morning, and he said, the furnace has gone out. I said, what's that to me? He said, well, I got to go down there and turn it back on. I said, well, it's a one-man job. I said, what do you want me for? He said, you're going to hold the hawk off. So I had to go down and watch the hawk while he fixed the furnace. The hawk wasn't going to bother anybody. It did bother that same kid that shot the great blue heron. I don't know, maybe the hawk figured out that the kid was not a bird lover. And he came over to see it one day, and I wasn't paying too much attention. When I turned around, the hawk was right in his face. And it raked his cheek. It just missed his eye. It had massive talons on it. And it raked his cheek. I asked him, what the hell did you do to the hawk? And he said, nothing. But I knew he did. So, anyway. So I tried to let it go at the end of Christmas break, but it wouldn't go. We lived right on the edge of the woods, and there was a road behind the house. So I took it out to the road and didn't like being picked up. I always wore a hockey glove when I picked it up, but it wouldn't leave. I'd throw it up in the air and it would land, because it was flying up and down the basement stairs. It had the dog terrified. So I knew it could fly. But I was throwing it up in the air and it just come right down to the road. And it'd look at me. So I threw it up in the air and it came right down to the road. The thing was eating too well is what the problem was. So I took it out to that same ski hill and dumped it out of a box. I went up to jump, dumped it out of a box, and it landed on the railing, but it still wouldn't leave. So I went, rah! And it took off and landed in a tree a ways away. And watch me drive off.
Um,
I suppose I should add that I was the one that shot the hawk in the first place.
so as a kid, teenager, did you ever have any experiences with dating at all, or?
Oh yeah, that was my favorite activity. I didn't drink or smoke. I tried smoking in junior high. I didn't care for it. And a friend of mine that I was doing it with got very sick, so I wasn't up for that. And, you know, I had friends that drank, but I didn't do it, so I kind of, they quit calling me up when they were going out. I suppose they were afraid I was going to squeal on them or something. I wouldn't have done that, but they felt nervous having a guy around that wouldn't drink, I guess. I found out years later that our football team had parties after every game. I found out years later because they knew I didn't drink. But I also found out when I got my driver's license that that was an advantage, because I found out it was a lot easier picking up girls when I was by myself than it was when I was with those guys. So it worked out. And that was my favorite activity in high school, I'd say, as far as socially. We had a lot of dances. We had dances every Friday and Saturday night, one in Grand Rapids, which is about 5 miles from Coleraine, and one in Beauvais, which is 1 mile from Coleraine. So I went to as many of those dances as I could, and you know, typically you'd ask a girl home. And
So we were talking about your dating experiences.
well, I had lots of girlfriends, yeah, lots. But nothing terribly serious until senior year.
Could you elaborate?
Well, I met this girl that I really liked, and we ended up going together. In fact, we ended up going steady, which was kind of a thing at the time. And that lasted for about a year.
All right. Would you say it was enjoyable?
Oh, quite, yes, as a matter of fact.
All right. So after Greenway High School, did you attend college?
Oh, yes, I worked in the summertime in Oregon, in Riddle, Oregon, in a nickel mine on the engineering crew. And this is kind of interesting. The most I made summer of my senior year was $2.63 an hour. And that paid for my entire education. My parents gave me almost nothing in the 4 years, and I went to a private school. When one of my sons, my youngest son, was planning on going to a private school in 1997, I figured for him to be able to do that, he would have to have a summer job that paid $45 an hour. So that's how much the cost of education has escalated since then. Maybe inflated would be a better word. So I went to St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. There it is. And I was going to be, still was planning on being a veterinarian, and my advisor talked me into going into straight medicine, so I did that. And it took me about a year and a half to realize I really did not want to do that. And what convinced me with chemistry and physics. Whoa. So I finally decided, well, what do you like to do? And I like to read, so I went into English. I wasn't going to teach because my dad was a teacher. This is how profound my thinking was at the time. And but I thought I'd better take education credits, because what do you do with an English degree? And I figured until I found that out, I could teach, and you know, just to cover that time. And senior year, I did student teaching. Second semester senior year, I did student teaching. I was pretty much hooked. So I became an English major midway through my sophomore year. So I had a lot to make up.
So, could you describe your experience in college?
I could. I wasn't exactly what you call a model student, nor the model citizen. I was the only senior in fact, on disciplinary probation, senior year. And I wasn't dating as much either, just hanging around with the guys, I guess, mostly. Probably did a little too much of that stuff at the expense of my education. But once I started teaching, I had to learn all those various things. I knew where to look anyway. So, I'll just put it this way, college lasted a few years beyond graduation.
So you first went to college in what year?
1960.
So would you say the Cold War and the Vietnam War had?
Well, the Cold War was on basically through my whole adolescence. And Vietnam was just really starting to heat up, say my junior year in college. No, we all had to take ROTC, freshman and sophomore year. And if we chose to take it junior and senior year, the government paid us, but they didn't for those first 2 years. And I really didn't have any interest in joining the military. And I had, the government cooperated. I had a very high draft number, it was lottery. And then I got deferred for being a student, I got deferred for being a teacher, I got deferred for getting married, I got deferred when our first child was born, and then they wiped all those deferments out, but I was 26 by that time and they weren't interested in me anymore. So if they had drafted me, I'd have gone, but at least up until 1969 I would have gone. But I didn't have any great interest in it. And I didn't think Vietnam was anything comparable to World War II, so.
So you said that ROTC was mandatory. Was there any experience in particular that made you not too favorable of it?
No, I mean, I just, I just wasn't in love with it. I mean, I didn't mind doing it. I was, my freshman year, they didn't have shoes in my size. So we had inspections on Fridays. I had to wear my own shoes. And I couldn't make it clear to the cadet captain in charge of our company when he inspected me that they didn't have shoes for me. So he gave me you could get a AA or a D for the day. And I kept getting D's for the day because I didn't have the right shoes. So I finally figured, why go? I mean, the worst was going to give me is a D for the day anyway. So I stopped going. Then out of curiosity, one day I went over and checked the chart in the gym where they had all this stuff listed, and I found out every day I had not gone, I got a AA. So it worked out. So that was my freshman year in ROTC. And then sophomore year, our very first Friday, where we're all dressed up in uniform, we had to go to class twice a week, and then we had drill on Friday. So our very first drill, we're all in uniform, and they started calling out the squad leaders. And, well, at least they started calling out names. And they told us to come out, or anybody got called to come out in the middle of the gym. So my name was called. So I thought, oh, this is going to be a reaction of last year. And then they said, now you guys are all squad leaders. And I, what? How can that be? After the freshman year I had, well, company commander was on the hockey team, and I looked around and every squad leader that was on the hockey, or every kid who was on the hockey team was a squad leader, so there we were. So I like that better than being a grunt, though, to be honest.
Could you explain why you liked being?
Well, I got to run the show with my squad, rather than take orders, I was giving orders, That was kind of fun.
All right, so you had mentioned that you had majored in English halfway through your sophomore year. So after college, where did you live?
Well, I got a job because I graduated with a 2.1 average. I got a job teaching in a small farm town in southern Minnesota called Leroy, in Leroy Ostrander High School. So I was an English teacher there for 2 years. In the meantime, I got married. I was down there by myself the first year, and then my wife, fiance, graduated the next year, and we moved down to Leroy together. And our first child was born in Rochester.
So could you describe your experience teaching at Leroy High School?
Well, I like the teaching. I've always liked the teaching. I've never been in a bad place where I disliked teaching. But living there was another story altogether. I mean, it's from a small town, but I had enough of it, I guess. And I wanted to get into a city where I could go back to school without having to move in the summertime to get my master's. So I was looking to go to the Twin Cities. That was my first choice. But there were no jobs in the Twin Cities even then. Everybody in Minnesota who taught wanted to teach in the Twin Cities, it seemed. I think they paid better than everybody else did, but there was nothing going on. So I saw that Milwaukee was advertising, or I should say interviewing at St. John's, and I couldn't drive up to St. John's. It was a long way away from where I was, and especially on a school day. So I wrote to them and came down here on a weekend to interview, and they offered me a job pretty much on the spot. Oh, that was 1966.
So you had mentioned your wife. When did you get married?
Summer of 1965. A year after I was out of college and a few months after she was.
And would you say that you both were pretty of similar interests in terms?
Well, we were interested in each other anyway. I don't think we had a whole lot in common. Catholic. So we both felt pretty strong about that. And we both like kids. She told me when she wanted to have a dozen. We're not going that far. But as it turned out, we wouldn't have anyway. So I was primarily interested in each other, I think, more than anything else. We didn't have a hell of a lot in common, I wouldn't say. In fact, when we were going together, and it started to get serious, my friends were telling her, "You're making a mistake."
Could you explain why that is?
Our personalities were quite different. She later told me, and this is just a few years ago, she said, you know, people thought I'd marry a really straight guy. I said, I would have been bored out of my mind. I wanted a guy who was kind of the bad boy. So, here you are.
So, after Leroy, where did you move to?
We moved to Milwaukee. And we lived in an apartment on the south side, down near the airport, for 9 months. Then we moved to 62nd and Blue Mound. And I got a job in Minnesota. So I went back, basically, and to try to find some place to live, and realized the guy who had interviewed me had lied about the availability of affordable housing in that area. So I decided I didn't want to work for a guy that lied. So I came back to Milwaukee, figured on staying a couple of years, and I was 4 years at Washington, and then went to university school for 9 years, and then here for the last 39. So it's been good. I like Milwaukee. I prefer the woods, but if I've got to live in concrete, Milwaukee's a good place to do it.
So prior to moving to Milwaukee, did you ever have any connections to the city itself?
Well, the only reason I really looked at it is because I had a couple good friends I went to college with that lived here, and so that made it a little more attractive to me. I don't think I would have thought about it otherwise, to be honest. We'd come down here a couple times for Braves games, so I knew a little bit about the city, but I would have looked for someplace else in Minnesota.
Could you describe your experience at those Brave games?
Well, I mean, I was pretty young. One time in junior high, one time in grade school. At the time, people could bring beer into the stadium, their own. And I remember one game we were playing the Cubs, the Braves were playing the Cubs. Then there were some guys from Chicago right behind us with a big cooler full of beer. So as the game went on, things got more and more raucous. But we had a good time, and they were decent people. And I saw a lot of the all-time greats play. Eddie Matthews, Warren Spahn pitched, Lou Burdette pitched. We saw a couple of games. Johnny Logan, Del Crandall, Andy Pafko. Who was this? Red Shane East, yeah, he was at second base. After, I think, O'Connell, what was his first name? Billy, I think. So we saw some pretty important players. Billy Bruton, Hank Aaron, his early years.
And were those games your primary experience with baseball?
Pretty much. I mean, you're living up in northern Minnesota, you don't see a lot of baseball. I mean, professional baseball anyway. Duluth had a team. We went to a few games there at AA or AAA, I don't remember which. That was it. But my brother was a Braves fan. I was a Philadelphia Phillies fan. We weren't going to Philadelphia to watch any games. There were no Twins at the time. So this was the closest we had to professional baseball.
And so you came here, came to Milwaukee in what year?
66.
And so, do you remember the Braves winning the title in '67 at all?
Yes, of course. I do. But I wasn't that into it. That was kind of fun.
And so upon first getting here in Milwaukee, would you say, what was your first job?
Washington High School. I got kind of surprised at that because when I interviewed with the assistant superintendent, he said during the interview, I see you played hockey. I said, yes. He said, do you still play? I said, yes. He said, it's a tough game. I said, well, it can be. And he said, do you care what part of town you get into? So when I saw Washington High School on the assignment sheet, I thought, well, this is going to be the toughest school in town. But it wasn't. It was actually one of the best, maybe the best school in the whole city. It had a tremendous reputation. And I was very lucky in that respect getting in there. I mean, to this day, some of the best classes I've ever had were at Washington High School.
So what was your experience teaching there like?
Well, for one thing, the civil rights movement was just starting to heat up. And I knew nothing about any of that. Growing up in northern Minnesota, there were no black people. We had native people, kind of on the fringes of things, but we no black people. I remember a black family moved in when I was a kid, maybe 8 years old, and they didn't last 2 weeks, they were gone. I mean, to tell you the attitude up there, there was a lawyer in town everybody referred to as the town Jew. So, I mean, Cadillacs were Jew boats, you know, that kind of business. The word nigger was thrown around relatively commonly, and there wasn't a black person anywhere except Duluth. You know, there's an air base. So they came down to play the local junior college sometimes in basketball, but that was about it. I went to Boys State as a junior, and I got to know a black kid down there pretty well. But that was my only experience with anybody of color at all, except for a few Indian kids that I went to high school with, but I didn't know them that well. So when I came down here and the civil rights thing was starting to heat up, and Washington at that time was 87% white. So there wasn't a whole lot going on. The school was very gradually integrating, and that was a factor. I mean, I heard a lot of racist stuff in the faculty lounge, as a matter of fact, about kids. And a lot of them just kind of took it for granted. I always thought it was wrong, but they didn't seem to care very much one way or the other. But the summer of '67, which was my first summer in Milwaukee, I was assigned to Pulaski High School for summer school, and then a guy called me and told me he had been assigned to Washington. He taught at Pulaski during the regular year. He found out I taught at Washington during the regular year. Would I trade? And of course, by that time, we were living close to Washington High School, so I thought, yeah, well, why not? So I walked in expecting to see a typical Washington High School class, about 28 white kids and a couple of black kids. Well, it was the reverse, because most of those kids came from North Division and Lincoln and West Division and schools that were predominantly black. And so it was about 28 black kids and a couple of white kids. So the minute I walked in that room, every racist thought I'd ever had, every racist thing I'd ever heard came flooding back. And I thought, this is going to be an interesting summer. And it turned out it was an interesting summer, because that was the summer of the riots. And we were getting along great. I mean, things were going very, very well. And then right near the end of the term, the riots took place. And I came back to school. The school was closed on Monday because the whole town was under curfew. I came back on Tuesday, and school was going to end on Thursday. There was a paper due on Monday, and I needed it to get it corrected and the grades done. And one girl didn't have hers, a black girl. And I said, where is it? And she said, well, I don't have it. I said, why not? She said, I didn't have time. I said, you didn't have time, you had an extra day. What were you doing? And another girl in the back, Pearline Flippin, old Pearline, said she was shopping down on 3rd Street. That's where all the looting took place. I don't think she was, but nevertheless. So we got to talking about the riots, and I found out most of those kids had spent the weekend hiding. They were afraid of bullets coming through the walls and everything else, and they were scared to death. So we talked a lot about that. So I learned probably more in that class than any one of the kids did, I'd have to say. I learned a lot about racial relations, and I learned a lot about people. And it was very invaluable to me. I would say a lot of the students I was closest to, not all of them, but a good number were black kids during the regular school year at Washington. Then I got involved in the civil rights movement. Oh, forgot this little tidbit. When school got out, we were going to go up to Minnesota, but the town was under curfew, and nobody could come in and nobody could go out after a certain time. But we wanted to go up there so to see both sets of parents. And so we left the house, and again, on 62nd and Blue Mound, about 2 in the morning. So we had a 1-year-old in the car, an infant, and my 13-year-old sister-in-law. And I was concerned about, I had a gun rack in the living room, and I didn't want that to be in plain view, given what was going on in town. So I took the guns and I stuck them in my trunk. Well, we didn't get 2 blocks, we got pulled over. And 2 cops. One was very cool, and the other one was scared to death. And he had a shotgun. You can tell by looking at him, this guy was very, very nervous. So I didn't talk to him at all. I looked at the other guy, they seemed more collected, and I told him where we were going and why and all this other kind of stuff. And he told me, he said, well, get on the freeway at 68th Street, and they followed us down to the freeway entrance. A little bit nervous there for a bit. I think having the kids in the car helped. But all the way out of town, there were a National Guardsman sitting along the freeway, making sure nobody came in. You couldn't buy gasoline at that time. Gasoline was rationed, and everything was closed up early in the day. So it was an interesting time. Then my last year at Washington, we had riots, race riots among the kids. And I got very involved in that. As a result, parent groups formed, white and black, and student groups formed, white and black. And so I went to their meetings, and at that time, the commandos were very active in Milwaukee. The civil rights marches were taking place at 200 days of civil rights marches and whatnot. And one of the guys that came in to talk to the kids at Washington was a guy named Joe McLean, who was, whereas Groppe was kind of the front man for the commandos, McLean was the guy who ran the organization. And I didn't know this until he came in, because he had a son at Washington High School. So he was very concerned about this. So he and I became friends, and he eventually got a job in Madison working for the state government. And that was pretty much the last I saw him. But, you know, we were close for a couple of years. And again, you know, I learned a whole lot that I certainly didn't learn growing up about people. That was one of the more exciting times of my life, I would have to say. And I think Milwaukee began to come of age during that period of time, too.
So, were there any particular students or teachers that you were really close to or remember?
You mean as a teacher?
Yeah, while teaching.
Well, yeah, I got a lot of friends, I mean, from Washington even. Some of them are dead now because they were all older than I was. But I still see some of the students. I go to reunions and things of that sort, you know, every now and again. So, yeah, I mean, those relationships have lasted a long time. Good number of them are in their 70s now.
So, teaching at Washington High School, you live close to Washington High School. Could you describe what your neighborhood or your house was like?
Well, it was a flat. We lived on the bottom floor of a 2-story flat, a duplex, and most of the houses in the neighborhood are like that. Made a lot of friends in that neighborhood, friends I still see, as a matter of fact. It was pretty tight. A lot of good people.
So on the weekends, what kind of stuff did you do?
Well, of course, I'm busy raising kids. That changes a lot of things. But I was still playing hockey. I was playing hockey at the Winter Club with a group they call the Old Men. But we had D1 players in that group. I mean, there were some really good players playing. And that was always a lot of fun. I mean, that was the reason I think I got the job at university school, because I got to know some of those people, and they were affiliated with the school. I didn't apply to university school. They called me. And, well, I mean, we just did things as a family. By that time, we had a lot of friends in town, so when we went out with them, went out with other teachers, went out with the guys I'd gone to college with, so there wasn't a shortage of things to do. It was a pretty calm time in spite of the racial stuff going on, you know.
And would you say that the racial conflict or tensions heating up at the time, did that change the living, how it changed how you live day to day, or?
No, I wouldn't say that, but it certainly did affect the way I dealt with people, and changed my interests a lot. My wife was not very happy with the fact that I was very involved in that at first. Then eventually she came around to it too. But so I immediately became interested in civil rights. I mean, that was a passion of mine from the beginning. And so I took part in some of the marches then and after. In fact, I remember one particular march I was in, I was walking with a photographer for the Journal. And there were guys up on statues all over the parade route taking pictures with very expensive cameras. And I asked him, does this guy work for the Journal? He said, no, he was government guys. I went to a meeting one time for an organization called TCB, Take Care of Business. They were trying to encourage black people to start businesses in the black neighborhoods. And So I became, and Joe McLean was in charge of that, so I became involved in it. And at one meeting, we figured out that everybody in the room was on the FBI list. So I expected that I probably was too, after having gone to that meeting, if no other reason. But the FBI had a room 900 feet long, full of files on people who were involved in civil rights. So I didn't care that I was on their list. I was kind of proud of it, as a matter of fact.
So you mentioned that you had met Joe McLean. Did you ever meet Father Grappi?
I did not. Saw him, close up a couple of times, but we never talked. I talked to a lot of the guys who were with him, but not him.
Right. And then, in terms of the mayor of the city, Mayor Meyer, what are your opinions?
Well, I think he was good for the city. I think he was somewhat taken aback by the fact that the city was growing very fast at the time, and he had a lot of factions he had to deal with. I mean, Milwaukee's always been a very segregated city. I mean, even before the racial thing, I mean, there were Jewish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods. This neighborhood right here was an Irish neighborhood. And most of the north side was German, and most of the south side was Polish. A term you heard relatively often at that time was Southside Polacks. I mean, that was just a common term. I don't hear it much anymore, but at that time you did. And Jews all lived, in various neighborhoods. I shouldn't say all, but a good number of them in enclaves, around the city. Washington High School was in the middle of a Jewish neighborhood, which people felt had a lot to do with the excellence of the school. I mean, I knew a guy, son of a neighbor of mine, went out to Los Angeles to interview for a job. And it turned out to be a 4-stage interview process. And he got there, and the room that he was in was full of people. And he thought, I'm going to be here forever. And somebody came out and called his name, and he went up to this person, and the person said, you went to Washington High School in Milwaukee? He said, yes. Well, you can skip the first 3 stages of the interview. And he got the job. I mean, he had a great reputation. And then our superintendent, Goucher, father of Mike Goucher, the TV guy, was superintendent at the time, redistricted the city. I'm sure he was working on the premise that segregated schools have more problems or segregated schools have fewer problems than integrated schools do. And so he redistricted the Washington district, which at the time ran from 20th Street to 100th Street. So the cross-section, the whole city, went to Washington High School. And he redistricted it, and it became predominantly a black school. He left to take over the education department at Indiana University, and within a year, the federal government slapped a desegregation suit on Milwaukee Public Schools.
So did you agree with this shift in school? Did you agree with the shift to
Oh,
magnet
no.
schools, or-
I and a couple of other people, teachers, went down to the school board meeting when they were talking about this and vigorously opposed it. We wanted Washington to stay the way it was. We figured it was a tremendous learning experience for every kid there, not just educationally, but socially as well. And it was gradually integrating, so that was good for everybody.
And so you mentioned how while you were teaching, you got involved with the civil rights movement a lot and meetings. Was there anything in particular that happened at any of these meetings that you remember? Or?
No, we just talked about, and one of the things I remember very well is that one of the problems they had was the effects of racism on people are devastating sometimes. And so oftentimes the victims of racism start to believe it. And so one of the problems the group had was trying to convince some black people that you didn't need a white person involved to make it work. the black people working with each other couldn't make it work, because a lot of these people were convinced if something was going to make any sense at all, it had to be run by somebody white. So that was one prejudice we had to try to dispel. I mean, I was kind of surprised at that, but you know, I guess it makes sense. I mean, racism is insidious. And that's probably the worst part of it, is when the victims start to believe it. But so then I went to university school, and there's a different environment. I like teaching there as well. A good number of my students' kids are here. And, but one thing I always was aware of is that I was not part of that community. They appreciated the job I was doing, and were very gracious in that respect, but I've always felt that teaching is serving a community, and a community of which you are a part. And I knew I was going to be part of that particular community. It just wasn't going to happen. So I was thinking again about going back to Minnesota. I did continue the racial campaign up there, taught an elective, as a matter of fact, called Black Revolutionary Literature for a good number of years, and brought Joe McLean in to talk to the kids. Was aware of speakers around town at UWM and places like that they could go listen to, but their parents oftentimes wouldn't let them go because they were afraid of what might happen when nothing was going to happen. But it was a nice place to teach. I mean, small classes, whereas at Washington the desks were bolted to the floor. Up there they weren't, and I could arrange the room the way I wanted to, pretty much the way I do it here in a horseshoe shape. And at the time, and they paid for my master's degree at Marquette University, and I ran into a teacher there that had a profound effect not only on my writing, but also my teaching as well. And I brought a lot of his stuff into the classroom. So, I mean, it was a good 9 years, I mean, really. But again, I wanted to get back to Minnesota. My wife wanted to get back to Minnesota. But for some reason, I couldn't get a job. In fact, at one town, needed a English teacher who could coach cross country. I had 15 years of experience, tremendous recommendations. I had a master's degree and 3 straight state championships in cross country. Didn't even get an interview. They let me know in June the position had been filled. So that wasn't working out. So one day, the administration at university school did something I felt was egregious. They fired a friend of mine whom they knew was leaving, so there was no reason to fire him. And one of their teachers, language teachers, was coming over here, and he happened to be the baseball coach, and I was coaching track, and our lockers were next to each other. Talk about fate. And I was just upset at what they had done, so I asked him, you know, they have the openings in English at Marquette High. He said they do. So I applied. I didn't get the job. Terry Kelly got the job. And I was upset about that because when I left, they asked me if it was okay to speak to the headmaster, so I thought I had it, but I didn't. So I had to reconcile myself with the university school, but 2 weeks later, Marquette High called again, and make a long story short, they had another opening. Tell you one thing that happened, you know, I've told this story to a lot of people, but Larry Seward, who was a principal here for a long time, was an assistant principal at that time, and he asked me why I wanted to leave university school, and I gave a number of reasons, and I finally said the aura of materialism in the place is more than I want to deal with anymore. I just don't want to deal with it. And he said, well, you're going to see the same thing here. And I said, Larry, I wasn't in your building 2 minutes this morning, and I knew I wasn't going to see the same thing here, and I haven't. I was out with some friends of mine a year ago, and some of them, you know, are younger. One of them went to King, and he said to us, you know, our attitude at Marquette High guys, they're a bunch of rich, spoiled snots. And I said, well, I think we have some kids come in like that. We have very few leave like that. And most of the other guys at the table were Marquette High grads, and they agreed. I think it was a very healthy place to be for everybody. I've never once thought about leaving here. Till now.
So did you ever attend any summer festivals in Milwaukee?
Sure, lots of them. See Bob Dylan, it was right there behind you, about 15, 20 times. Lots of festivals. Eric Clapton, Jimmy Buffett. Saw Clapton down at Alpine Valley. Night Stevie Ray Vaughan got killed. So I saw Stevie Ray Vaughan too. His last concert ever. Sure. That's one thing I really like about living in a city as opposed to a small town. You want to go to games, you want to go to concerts, things like that. You live in a small town, you got to travel. It's a bit of a pain. But here, especially living where we live, I can decide that day to go. I just drive down there. It's nice. And Milwaukee gets a lot of stuff. They don't get quite what Minneapolis, St. Paul gets, but they're doing pretty well. You got, you know, professional drama for one thing. That's good. 2 universities.
So, the civil rights was going on late 60s, early 70s. That was really starting to heat up. But Vietnam War was still going on. Was that easy to like see within Milwaukee life at the
Well,
time? Or?
yes, it was. I was watching the news on New Year's Eve, 1968. And the commentator, who was one of the giants, Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, Huntley Brinkley, one of those guys came on, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Thank God that one's over." I mean, everybody was affected by what was going on. We had, in 1968 alone, Bobby Kennedy got killed. Martin Luther King got killed. The Democratic National Convention erupted into riots. People were tear gassed, people were arrested. It was just horrible in many respects. The anti-Vietnam demonstrations, put down by National Guard and whatnot. People were being shot. And the political situation, the racial situation. I mean, there was no way you could possibly be alive at that time and not be impacted by all of that stuff. And it was as true in Milwaukee as it was anywhere else.
Did you ever have any close friends or like students that you knew that got drafted?
Oh yes. In fact, when I was at Washington, they had 2 graduations. They had one in January, one in June. And the January class of '69 was one of my favorites ever. And one of the guys went to UWM and enrolled in ROTC. And then he had a change of heart about midway through the first semester and dropped out. And the federal government's tactic at that time, when somebody dropped out of ROTC, was draft him immediately, which they did. He got drafted within 2 days. And he was not going to go. He was going to go to Canada. So I got a call about midnight one night, because they knew I stayed up late, asking if I would write a recommendation for this kid. So I did, but my first plan was to talk him out of it. So they came over to school the next day, he and the friend, and we got to talking. And I finally said to him, "You know, you can't come back." And he started to cry. He said, "I know. I just don't want to kill people." And that was an epiphany for me, because I realized that having grown up in the aftermath of World War II, and having grown up in a staunch Catholic family, It had never occurred to me for some reason that the two were at odds with each other. The staunch patriotism and the staunch religious fervor, oftentimes at odds with each other. And I thought the kid didn't want to get himself killed. And he said, I don't want to kill anybody. And I thought to myself at that moment, geez, that's the way I should have thought. So I became very much against the war from that particular point on. And he did go to Canada, a very bright kid, ended up washing dishes up there. Fortunately, there was an amnesty later on, and he's now living in Texas and doing quite well. But that was nasty.
And did your sentiments, or in schooling and teaching, how did you like broach the subject of the wars?
I was pretty honest about it. We got in a lot of arguments, that and the racial stuff. I was seen as a bit of a maverick, I suppose, an outlaw, especially at university school when I was bringing all this stuff up. Radiclib, I think was the word was being used at the time, but I didn't care. I persevered. They had the Vietnam Wall, a replica of the Vietnam Wall, out on what is now Quad Field. Not Quad Field, but Tacton Field. And I went out there one day and found names of people I knew, people I'd grown up with, people I'd taught, had been killed over there.
And so in '67, the Dow Chemical protests in Madison took place. Did that have any effect here?
Well, everybody knew about it, you know, and there was a lot of people choosing sides, you know, as to which way you should think. So there was, you know, you could very easily get into an argument, if not a fight, around here during those years. Simply by opening your mouth in the wrong crowd. So it was hot. Much more so than it has been since. Very alive that time.
Would you say that you miss that feeling, or?
Well, I don't miss what was going on that inspired that feeling. I miss that passion, certainly. I think that, you know, getting passionate about things, people seem to be more accepting, and a lot of people seem to me to be a lot more self-serving than people were. I think probably the number of self-serving people is no different, but the number of people who are passionately for humane things has diminished quite a bit. However, that may change shortly. Who knows?
And so upon going to USM and then to Marquette University High School after that, did you have to move living?
No, we did that. We lived in the same place for another, well, come to think of it, it was only 3 more years. Then we did move, but it was just north of there, at 56 and Locust. And I lived there for the rest of the time I was at university school. And so I was driving, you know, to the university school at the time. The upper school was where the Jewish Athletic Association is now on Santa Monica Boulevard, so I did drive and make that commute every day. And after I came to Marquette High, we moved to 64th and 74th in Blue Mound.
And could you describe like what those neighborhoods looked like, or what they felt like?
Well, you mean in terms of now? Things haven't changed very much. I think my old neighborhood, the 56 and Locust neighborhood has changed a lot in terms of its racial mix. The neighborhood in Wauwatosa has been very stable, hasn't changed much at all. I wouldn't mind seeing a little more change in that neighborhood than we have, but I like the neighbors and I like the proximity, and I think people are pretty good people there. People I know anyway. That's been pretty stable. 56 and Locust, not quite so much, but it's, it seems to be a pretty good neighborhood today. I drove up there not long ago to take a look, and this looks to be in pretty good shape.
So were there any students in particular from USM, University School of Milwaukee, that stood out to you?
Oh, many of them, yeah. As I said, I really liked teaching there. When I left, a lot of kids would come over here and visit, mostly girls. People here had the idea that because I was very staunchly for single-sex schools that I didn't like girls, and yet some of the best relationships I had when I was teaching co-ed, and I was 15 years teaching co-ed, were with the girls. So that was nonsense. I just think co-ed, single-sex, there should be a single-sex choice. And studies that they've done basically determine that boys do better in single-sex situations and girls do much better in single-sex situations. I know for a fact, things I say to guys in class and things like that, I would never say those things if girls were in the room. Guys would be embarrassed by it. I think the guys here can be a lot more honest about who they are, because they don't have to worry about that particular pressure.
And
there are some guys who wouldn't say anything if there were girls in the room, who don't mind talking in front of boys.
And then with regards to Marquette University High School, are there any particular students or events that stand out to you with your experience?
There's too many. There's a lot. I'm really close to a lot of the runners, some of the hockey players. I wasn't in hockey quite as long as I was in running, but yeah, I've got over 2,500 Facebook friends, and I know them all. And most of them are Marquette High grads. So yeah, I can't go anywhere without running into somebody.
So when did you first start coaching?
First year I taught, 1964. Coached football and track. I did that for 4 years. Oh yeah, I also coached girls softball 1 year. And then when I got to Washington High School, I coached football and track. I also directed plays when I was in Leroy, which is something I missed doing, to be honest. But there, they had play practice in the evening, and here it conflicts with athletic practices, so you can't do both. Then when I got to university school, I coached football. I coached cross country, and then I got back into football. But at that time, however, I had fallen in love with cross country, so the next year I went back into cross country, and I've never looked back on that one. But I also started coaching hockey while I was up there, and track.
And would you say that coaching has made a big impact on your life?
It's been huge. I mean, the people I've known. I think athletics, when I started, people would talk about coaches who taught and teachers who coached, And I have come to believe that it's the same job. It's just a different classroom. And what people learn in athletics is just as valuable as what they learn in the classroom. So just a different venue, that's all. I have really enjoyed being involved in that and watching guys grow up.
And did you win any state titles, or were there any experiences in coaching that
I've been
stand
involved
out?
in teams that won state titles 32 or 33 times, either as a head coach or assistant coach. So yeah.
Do you have a particular, so you mentioned that you love cross-country running, is that your
Well,
favorite sport?
that became
Or-
a passion for me. I mean, I think hockey is the best game ever invented, but there's nothing game about cross-country. It's pure sport. Nobody plays it. So I would have to say that that became my number one passion. Although hockey wasn't very far behind and track was okay. It augmented the cross-country season, you know, but I enjoyed everything I did. I made sure of that. And again, working with kids, I mean, how can you go wrong?
So you coached hockey at USM, and then, so upon coming to Marquette University High School,
Well,
then-
I coached hockey, I coached our JV team. And then when my sons got old enough, I quit that and started coaching the youth teams. And when my youngest son, who's 10 years younger than my next youngest son, he started getting into it. I decided it's time for me to quit. I was coaching 3 sports, and I've been coaching 3 sports for over 30 years. So it was time to give something up. And so I got him out of hockey. Then I felt guilty about it, put him into floor hockey. And it turned out the guy who was running the floor hockey team at the Y didn't know anything about hockey. So I got enlisted to coach that team. I thought, well, what the hell, if I'm coaching floor hockey, I might as well be coaching ice hockey. So the next year I went back into it again. And then a year or so later decided, well, okay, I'm gonna get out. And I was gonna get him out. And it just so happens, that was the year Marquette High starts a team. So they came to me and said, we need a coach. You're the only person in the building that can really do it. So I said, well, I'll give you 2 years. That'll be it. So my biggest problem was breaking this to my wife, whom I had told I was going to get out entirely. So I had planned a strategy, and that night at dinner, I executed it, and I finished up by saying it's only going to be 2 years. And the 9-year-old at the table said, wait a minute. I said, what? He said, you coach my brothers. I said, Brendan, that's another 9 years. He said, I don't care, you coach my brothers. I looked at her and she said, it won't be that bad. So finally, 11 years later, I was out of hockey, as a coach anyway.
do you ever miss coaching
Sure.
hockey?
Oh, yeah. What I don't miss is the period, free period I took every single day to plan a practice, and the other free period I took every single day to sharpen skates. Those I don't miss at all. I miss the games.
So do you have any final words about your time in Milwaukee, or anything that you?
Well, I mean, I'm glad I live here. I'm glad I have lived here. I mean, I've really come to love this city, and, you know, I have so many friends. I mean, now I'm talking about retiring. I'm not gonna go anywhere. I'm gonna stay right where I am. I'd have to start all over someplace else, and I don't wanna do that. This town has a lot to offer, and I think it's still growing. I think it's got a long ways to go in many respects, but it's working on it. And there are a lot of people serious about that kind of thing. So,
Is there any
good place to be.
is there any one thing in particular that you think should change, or is,
Well, I'd like to see less segregation, definitely. I mean, I know I said earlier, the town kind of comes to it naturally, but I'd still like to see that happen. I don't think, it's like, Belfast in Northern Ireland. They put up these huge walls separating Catholic neighborhoods from Protestant neighborhoods, thinking that's gonna keep the peace. The peace isn't gonna be kept till they knock those walls down, and people have to live with each other. It's very hard to be prejudiced against somebody you know. So I think the more people commingle, the more people get to know each other, the fewer problems we're gonna have of that sort. And it's a healthy thing too. I would like to see the lunch tables, this particular school, as a matter of fact, integrate. You got all Hispanic kids, not all, but many Hispanic kids sitting at one table, many black kids sitting at another table, white kids all over the damn cafeteria, I'd like to see more people make an effort. I think one of the impediments is the dating business. I think that's got to get broken down for any real progress to get made, but it's not an impossibility.
and do you have any stories that we've missed, or anything that you want to tell that it has not yet been covered?
I can't think of anything. I'm sure that I'll probably think of something when I leave here. Can't think of anything at the moment. Milwaukee's a very different town today than it was in the 60s. But Milwaukee is a slow town to grow. When I was, my big trip, spring break in college, was hitchhiking to Milwaukee from central Minnesota. And I got picked up outside of Fond du Lac by a guy, and he started talking about Milwaukee. And one of the things he said was, it's just a big, small town. And I think it was a pretty good description. One thing about that particular trip, however, I was going to stay with a friend of mine at 88th and Burleigh. I knew nothing about streets in this town. I mean, I knew 88th was one past 87th, but that was about as far as I could go. And he said, well, finally, he said, this is where you get off. And I said, well, can you tell me how to get to 88th and Burleigh? He said, you're there. He went out of his way and dropped me off at 88th and Burleigh, 2 houses away from the house I was looking for. So that was the first good first impression of Milwaukee, was that guy. And I think, by and large, a lot of good people in this town.
So, I mean, previously you had mentioned that you were super into civil rights movement and you got really involved in that. Is there any particular time in your life that you would say is your favorite time, or
No,
is it?
no. I've enjoyed pretty much all of it. Every decade has, new occurrences, new challenges, new people. Some babies. So,
All right, so behalf of me and my teammates here, we just want to thank you.
well, if you think of anything else, just let me know, and we can do that, but. Okay,
All right.
yeah?